Hi everyone, and welcome to my presentation. I want to acknowledge that I will be speaking about some difficult topics today, including my own personal experiences, the work that I do in sexual violence, as well as racism and racial trauma. I want to encourage everyone to take good care of yourselves today as you are going through my presentation, doing what you need for yourself, and paying attention to what your body needs. I want to start off today with a land acknowledgement. I am located on Treaty 6 territory and Métis Region 4 territory, Amiskwachi, a traditional home and gathering place for many Indigenous peoples, including Blackfoot, Niitsitapi, Cree Nehiawak, Dene, Nakota Sioux, Saulteaux, Métis, and specifically the ancestral space of the Papachase Cree. My journey to social work started very early on in my life. I always knew from a young age that I wanted to be a support to other people. I grew up in a Punjabi Indian family, in a home with a lot of abuse and trauma. Unfortunately, my parents both struggled heavily with addictions and mental illness, which contributed to an environment of domestic violence. My grandmother took my sister and I in when our parents were unable to raise us. In our case, it really was true that it takes a village to raise a child. With the support of my grandma, aunt, and uncle, my sister and I were able to experience some pockets of stability and peace where we wouldn't have had the chance otherwise. I knew I wanted to carry forward the love, generosity, and unconditional care that I was shown and use it to support the healing of others. When I started the MSW, I felt a little unsure and lost about what my place in social work was. I had gone straight from high school into psychology, and then into my BSW and then my MSW. I had worked in a range of settings, mostly supporting children and families with mental health and trauma. I knew I wanted to practice clinical social work in trauma, but I was still trying to figure out my area of passion. On May 25th, 2020, George Floyd was murdered. I was devastated and profoundly impacted by the events of the Black Lives Matter movements. It really started me on a journey of confronting my own experiences with racism in my life. I came to realize that many of the struggles my family had could be traced back to racial oppression, colonization of India leading to intergenerational trauma, and trauma from immigration, coming to Canada and facing racism. I started to confront the ways in which the culture and language in my family had been erased and suppressed due to racial trauma. I realized that working to support immigrant and racialized communities was a big passion of mine. So, what is racial trauma? Racial trauma can be defined as the mental and emotional injury that is caused by encounters with systemic racism, individual racism, racial bias, ethnic discrimination, racist abuse, and/or hate crimes. Racial trauma impacts the body. The stress can lead to a variety of health issues. Racial trauma also impacts beliefs about the self and identity, often can be rooted in shame. The other thing to keep in mind about racial trauma is that vicarious trauma can develop as a result of indirect experiences. So witnessing a loved one experiencing racism, watching racism in the media, or other indirect experiences. And often this can be under-recognized due to lack of awareness among clinicians or perhaps discomfort surrounding conversations about race in therapeutic or medical settings. So we need to address the fact that racism has an impact on mental health. We need to be addressing race in the therapy room. Racial trauma can also be passed on through generations. So it's important to recognize intergenerational trauma, as well as historical trauma, so complex and collective trauma experienced over time and across generations by a group of people who share an identity or a circumstance. So this could include colonization, systemic racism, mass trauma exposure, and a history of oppression or marginalization. So this means understanding traumatic experience individually while also considering these collective and intergenerational trauma impacts as well. My Grandmother's Hands is a book that I utilized for my capstone, and it's an interesting read regarding the impact of racial trauma on our bodies. So the author states that racial trauma is embedded in all bodies, including white bodies, and that white supremacy and racism is a deep body experience. Therefore, anti-racism work is somatic. We need to heal our bodies from racism and white supremacy. So to quote the book, "A calm, settled body is the foundation for health, for healing, for helping others, and for changing the world." This book really got me interested in utilizing somatic therapy. So, racial trauma can actually lead to the development of race-based post-traumatic stress. So this is actually a set of symptoms that are comparable to PTSD. This specifically develops as a result of direct or indirect exposure to encounters with racism, racial discrimination, racial injustice, or microaggressions. So this includes symptoms of intrusion, avoidance, and/or arousal that can be exhibited emotionally, physiologically, cognitively, or behaviorally. And this is not often recognized as part of a PTSD diagnosis in the DSM-5. Again, like I mentioned before, barriers to discussions regarding race in therapeutic and medical settings, and not always enough awareness about this. One thing that I realized was that I actually had developed race-based post-traumatic stress, and this was from complex experiences with racism in the world and in my family, as well as I started to experience racism at work. And it took a big toll on my mental health, where I started to experience a lot of heightened trauma symptoms that I didn't have the words to name until I started to read more about race-based post-traumatic stress and discuss it with my own individual therapist, and then, identifying that that was something that I was experiencing. With the work that I do in sexual violence at the Sexual Assault Center of Edmonton, I think it's really important to address intersectionality. So I have a quote here from Kimberly Crenshaw. "Intersectionality is a lens through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it interlocks and intersects. It's not simply that there's a race problem here, a gender problem here, and a class or LGBTQ problem there. Many times, that framework erases what happens to people who are subject to all of these things." I started to recognize intersectionality in terms of identities, different intersecting identities that people hold, and also intersections of experiences. So people who have experienced racism, systemic racism, and also have experienced sexual violence. So as I started to research more into this, I found that racialized people are disproportionately impacted by sexual violence. And this is because the attitudes and behaviors that allow for sexual violence to occur in society are also reinforced and rooted in racism. So it's about that power and control. And also through my work at the Sexual Assault Center of Edmonton, we were finding that it was less likely for people from different racial communities and cultural communities to be able to access supports for sexual violence. There was mostly white, middle to upper class women accessing our services. So I started to realize that we needed to create more inclusivity and create an environment where people with intersectional identities can feel comfortable to be able to access the supports that we offer, and for us to keep in mind how race plays out with these power dynamics with sexual violence. Here's a quote from Angela Davis, a Black author and political activist. In a racist society, it is not enough to be non-racist. We must be anti-racist. Here are some of my thoughts about anti-racism and decolonizing trauma work. We all have biases and gaps in what we know. These come with being human. However, it is crucial that we first take the time to recognize and understand our own bias. So being anti-racist is an active commitment to unlearning and challenging what we know. And this is a lifelong learning commitment. Understanding what we might represent to the people that we're supporting. So understanding historically and currently how the profession of social work can contribute to oppression and harm. For me, it's about reflecting on my own social location and what is my role as an oppressor versus an oppressed person. Understanding my own culture and coming to terms with how I can be in the practice of cultural humility with the folks that I'm supporting. So reflecting on how you can create safe spaces for folks from marginalized backgrounds to feel that safety to share and contribute. How can we amplify marginalized voices? How do we rethink what safety looks like? And also rethinking what trauma healing looks like. There's a lot of buzzwords going on in the trauma world about evidence-based practices for trauma work and best ways to go about trauma healing. I think it's important for us to recognize the strengths that different communities already hold in trauma healing and how we can use culture and spirituality for trauma work. And also building meaningful relationships and trust. The power of relationships, being able to share that power with other people, to really utilize storytelling and different ways of knowing, intentional self-disclosure when appropriate, as well as rethinking this idea of self-care and individualism and kind of broadening that out to how can we show up in community? What does community care look like? How can we support different cultural and racialized communities? I started the community counseling program at the Sexual Assault Center of Edmonton, which is meant to go into community, go to different agencies to build relationships, bridge support to sexual assault services, and reduce barriers to access to services. So this can be done in a variety of ways, whether it's individual support or counseling, advocacy and resources, providing consultation to service providers, or providing tailored workshops and educational presentations to the community. So one of the ways that I tried to work from an anti-racist decolonizing framework was the creation of a new group. So I created the Solidarity Group for Immigrant Women with my practicum placement at SACE. And this was a partnership with the Islamic Family and Social Services Association. So it's a new educational and support group for immigrant women to learn about topics such as trauma, abuse, consent, healthy relationships, and self-care from a cultural and spiritual lens. So I wanted to create a new space for immigrant women, trans inclusive, to gather, support each other, to have a safe space that they might not have, and to start to open up the conversations about things that are really difficult to talk about. And this entire group was community led. So I consulted with the community. I asked for lots of feedback from newcomers serving agencies about what they would want to see in a group for immigrant women. And each step of the group, every week we consult with the participants and make sure that everyone is comfortable with the content, and we integrate feedback throughout the entire group. So it's an 8-week group that goes through different topics. I also co-authored the booklet Landed: Relationships and Consent in Canada, which is a new resource that helps newcomers learn concepts of sexual violence in Canada. Topics include definitions of consent, sexual assault, trauma, examples of sexual harassment, and community resources, all written in accessible language with accessible design and layout. Although I have learned a lot in my MSW program, my journey is just beginning. I'm really excited to see how I can continue to grow and learn and expand in my clinical practice as I step out into the world as an MSW. I am committing to further developing myself professionally and personally, continuously reflecting on my practice and evolving the ways that I can incorporate anti-racism and decolonizing practice into my work. Thank you so much for sharing this journey with me. Thank you for witnessing my story, and I wish you all the very best of luck as you embark on your own journeys.